those that make a deal with the devils from the devil's religion, such as, but it's not limited to, the foundational state-compelled religion of the Confederacy and its white supremacy, need to understand that the devils overpromise and underdeliver, and functionally, they deal in souls. They make these contracts in order to guarantee the collapse of people's lives, which, by definition, is ruined and hyper-accelerated in order to get them to die so that they can be claimed as a soul. And those that participated in the racket of convincing the person to do so are promised rewards in the overpromise and under-delivering, which is, by definition, the renouncing of Jesus Christ, and thus is the renouncing of the capability of redemption. And in this quality, have actively pursued their false assumption from the Looking Glass and other military intelligence programs. Now, the military has the capability of engaging in body control, which includes short clips, probably 5 to 10 seconds, of visual uh, pictures, which they can imprint onto somebody's mind temporarily, which they do for military harassment campaigns. And the nerve hacking allows them to engage in active audio engagements from that same mechanism, from the low touch surveillance, which penetrates walls and doesn't seem to have a mechanism to block it outside of David Boles' original, as intelligence oversight, equipment to engage in a jamming signal. The only thing that will stop it is a signal stopping it. Walls won't stop it, materials won't stop it. Um, so, by definition, it becomes a game of coding in order to engage in the contest against each other from the military industrial educational complex, which has sold to the Satanists the capacity to engage in kidnapping and human trafficking and satanic ritual abuses, which uh, General Malice and others have actively promoted, which are the extension of hate crimes against the general public for arbitrary abuses which they pretend are experiments in order to engage in the satanic activities of ritual abuse, which they have done so in order to collapse the general system, as the United States is the last bastion of freedom to exist in the world. When they collapsed the United States, they would have provided the highest value to the Satanists, which hyper-accelerates their capability to engage in the one world satanic government from Revelation. Now, the normal deal with the devil construct is people who pursue the devils in the first place, but the primary mechanism of their collection is derived by physical human activity and the use of overriding powers by reality and its actual functional abuses as they engage in their claimed contact with the devils in order to receive orders from them operating the black market in exchange of one service for another service as they are promoted by these criminal powers. And to this extent, those kidnappings engage in the ritual abuses against the general public, which is designed to force them against their will into a racketeering scheme where they are tricked or abused into complying with having sold their soul or destroyed their lives, at which point the system is actively incorporated into the government's codes, as the United States rule of law is systemically replaced by the Confederate customs without reason. The satanic deals are infused into the code, and they engage in their racist dog whistles in order to promote these positions as they sustain themselves off of the criminal market. And thus, those who validate the crime, such as the framing campaigns, um, by definition, are funding the existence of the activity, similar to uh, the COINTELPRO MK Ultra terrorist operations, which generates its collusion with the Iran Contra, which has been the selling of criminal narcotics in order to engage in funding, and the activity of exchanging in the criminal market as a funding source for the witchcraft is the mechanism for the black markets trades under the deals with the devil, where the captured people who specifically target children as a high grade fetish for the devils um, engages in these malicious abuses for the sake of conversion. And they have infiltrated the churches, and those claiming the church functions are actively promoted under those devil contracts from their druids, priests, to engage in the malicious child abuses, um, which become standard practice by these satanic freaks. To this extent, their criminal policies are actively corrupting the entire system for those ritual subversions, such as the corruption of the police force into Confederates on patrol engaged in slave raidings for the prison industrial complex, which is then corrupted into degrading itself so that those who are participating as abused and abusers are both corrupted into compliance with the subject and amplifying the domestic abusers, such as, but is not limited to, the guards who are then forced into a position where they are not allowed to be amiable and thus are compelled into the psychological position where they then are ritually transformed into the Satanist objective and transformed in this thing by the renewing of the corruption, which is amplified, at which point anyone who conducts the higher offenses cannot be arrested or opposed or subverted under the pretense that it's beyond people's pay grades, despite the fact it is exactly their pay grades and exactly their jurisdiction and exactly their authority to arrest the abusers engaged in those crimes, uh, barred from the government conducting those actions, which is their claim that they're doing so as the government, which by definition they are not. To this extent, as a terrorist insurgent without a legal government loyal to the Confederacy, they are operating without any authority or justification, and very much so can be arrested and sentenced. And the retaliations derived by the enemy combatants to the United States are not lawful and would require active military opposition, as the criminal abuses and threats of terrorism by the hate group, which has infiltrated the government at all levels, including the federal government, must by definition be dissolved in order to engage in the function of national security, as making aid and giving comfort to enemies of the United States, which includes directly devils, who are the highest grade enemy of the country, would by definition be an act of treason punishable by death. These arbitrary abuses are infinitely diverse. If you could label something as a crime, then it's a part of their market and a foundational aspect of their identity. To that end, you have to assume that everything, no matter what, is a criminal scheme derived by the racketeering, such as, but it's not limited to, let's give a hypothetical example, which I don't directly know that is valid. as far as something that has physically happened, what is perfectly within the realm of reason, as it would actively reflect on other activities which are verifiably true and thus would be considered standard operating procedure in the military operation against the American government by the double agents. If you have a criminal operation of, let's say, there is a smoking rule about marijuana that people under the age of 18 are not allowed to do so. The political violence of the Hegelian dialectic, which states that as above, so below, creates the capability of making the conversion of a false opposition and thus a false thing to be destroyed, which has to be hyper amplified by false flags in order to generate the pretense of the aggression, which then engages in the activity of the pendulum swinging. And the function of the pendulum swinging has both yes and no concerning the punishment of the activity. If yes, the investment into punishing the activity, then they receive the funding. And if no, then this subject becomes protecting the thing and thus punishing anyone who would go after it. And thus, to this extent, the devil worshippers are actively in the middle, dodging the pendulum at both ends, as it's beyond law enforcement's pay grades, according to the Confederate magic, to be able to arrest them so that there is no remedy to a secret, so that the crimes can happen in perpetuity by the devil worshippers' rebellion. To this extent, if you have an example of um, someone who is predicted according to those estimates from the military intelligence in collaboration as a contradiction to the interest of the devil worshippers and their black market, then you have the hate crimes such as the political violence, the social violence, the economic violence in order to engage in the military operations against the unarmed civilians for that action. To that extent, if you have a minor who is presumed capable of legalizing the marijuana, not just straight out legalizing it, but legalizing it to the minors. Now, some say legalizing it should be criminal, and some say that legalizing it should be restrained to an age group, is the base argument, and thus those who worship Satan would actively be engaged in the middle of that pendulum, which would then try and engage in brokering the trade so that they could extort the general resources for the opposition. So the capability of the minor in order to overpower the entire question entirely makes them a material threat. Uh, the whole of the rules is do as thou wilt. The whole of their worship is liberty from God. The whole of their idealism is anarchy. And to this extent, you can put makeup on the pig if you like, but anarchy is anarchy. Lawlessness, no government, no protection, no social defense is no social defense. To this extent, you have the hyper amplification of the aggression against the various targets who would be capable of these political influences, which would then materialize the destruction of their racket, which they retaliate against, and thus they engaged in the military campaigns against the threats to their crime. And to this extent, you have the mechanism that the false argument that it should only be for those who are above a certain age would actively engage in the aggressions for the satanic rituals from the black market to actively amplify the abuses against the party, which would generate the same or worse negative consequences specifically derived by the activity, such as lung disease or cancer or something along these lines, which by definition would be done to them on purpose as a function in the black market, which, as a retaliation, allows them to sustain themselves under their hate crimes as they pretend the veneer of social legitimacy, as they have to sustain themselves as a public figure in order to maintain their position in the government or otherwise in the social well graces as a double agent compromising the general public, and thus has to keep their mask on so that they can remain disguised. To this extent, their protection of that system is not only the direct capability of their access, but also the protection of the distributions for others as security operations of aiding and abetting and giving comfort to the function, guaranteeing the well-oiled machine stays running a toot, a toot, a toot, which means by definition that the crime that they say is a crime cannot be stopped or subverted in any particular way, as they have full control of all of the mechanisms, and thus the means of disillusionment doesn't exist, and thus their protected group of wizards and wizard associates, who are also making deals with the devil, can then take in other parties who would then make deals with the devil in order to have access to this criminal market under their protection, and thus the substance that they are claiming to oppose cannot be dissolved because it is actively protected for the racketeering purpose, which they have full control over and cannot be opposed, which is a function of the original FBI activity as an extension of the Pinkertons, which has generated the blackmail operations, such as, but is not limited to, the activity of actively blaming people for the things that they aren't participating in, or the engagement of entrapment schemes, which actively promotes the existence of the thing, which gives the false justification of the existence of the black market in order so the substances can exist, in order for them to have distributed under the promise. And thus you have an extension of the terror factory, which engages in the activity of the creation of terrorist plots, some meant to be dissolved and some meant to go through, at which point the terrorist plots that are meant to go through, such as 9/11, can happen and generate all of the Confederates' goals, which are hyper accelerating their returns under the racketeering mechanism from their deals with the devil, which has promised them the money and the power, such as the prohibited policies derived by the Patriot Act and other such functions, which are a direct aspect of having come straight from hell in order to destroy the United States. As the statement comes in true, the devil worshippers have to tell the truth. And in the action that the devil worshippers have to tell the truth when engaging in the higher magic mechanism, um, George W. Bush put it out clearly and had to tell the truth in order for it to properly work. And it can be summarized in the fact that the terrorists hate the United States for its liberty. And thus, you have the mechanism of having told the truth directly and giving the public enough information in order to know that the ones who hate their liberty are the terrorists, and thus the Sudoku racket allows them to engage in the Sudoku puzzle uh, to competently be able to figure out if they're not entirely incompetent or not paying attention, so that they can justify the existence of the thing and give permission to it, knowing that it is fraudulent, and thus have accepted their place in the delusion. And in the activity of having accepted their place in the delusion, directly rejected the fact that those who are systemically destroying the freedoms in the United States by the insurgents' policies, under the fake pretenses which are directly understood to be false, are accepted under that delusion as an infectious disease, which they are. And at that activity, they have succeeded at the higher magic for having put down that function while conducting all of the obligations for the ritual to have succeeded, allowing for the very successful war, which is gone on for an extended period of time, uh, beyond any rational comprehension, derived by the potency of the devil's magic. To this extent, you bring it back to the story, you have the engagement of the corruption from this story, which I have low connections to, but can verify that it is well within the reasonable comprehension. Um, to be honest, but I cannot directly verify the exact source or give away any of the parties. Um, the definition of the political influence of the minor to be able to break the marijuana or other functions as a political activity generates the retaliation of those who are defending the racketeering function, and thus they attack the ability to have conducted the legalization from the minor by conducting the child sacrifice of the minor, and thus have settled it by their hate group under their KKK contracts, which they pretend at various levels of occult knowledge and access to them, um, is not really significant, which starts off as a not very interesting kind of retarded drinking club, which, if you have studied your history, you understand that the KKK started off as a drinking club and has hyper radicalized its terrorist operations. And the only reason we don't actively have to deal with KKK activities directly in an obvious way, actively being promoted by the propaganda, is the progress of the United States, such as, but it's not limited to, the banning of the mass in public spaces, which has actively subverted the white supremacist ability to openly demonstrate, as they have in the past, such as in DC, for their support for the hate group or the hyper radicalized racists and their dog whistles, as the activity of being themselves directly became reprehensible. They then had to add degrees of subtlety, subversion, and intrigue, hyper amplifying their obligation to use the deals with the devils and the sacrificing of their souls in order to engage in subversive logic uh, for those trickeries, compelling them to be subjugated to the spells more than their activity of leveraging the spell, which has hyper diversified the function, which has led to the fracturing of the Confederacy into more than just the white supremacists, which is something that the white supremacists are planning to collapse all of the other political identities in the factions, as the compulsion, once the Americans have been collapsed beyond any reprehensible, recognitionable, recognizable ability to restrain them as a substantive force, will then engage in the act of the Civil War, and thus the threat of the arbitrary natures and the war crimes derived by conducting a civil war to destroy the Confederates' phantom cell operations is non substantive, as those horrors are inevitable by virtue of the existence of the Confederacy, which, if it does destroy the United States, which is an act of treason, and thus supporting that trajectory is itself an act of treason, punishable by death, then by definition, that activity has to continue on infinitely as the function of the purging and their hyper purging activities, as they eradicate everyone who is not the right type of white, would engage in those hate crime activities. And after the Civil War, the blacks in the Deep South were more oppressed and murdered and subverted and less safe than they were in the middle of the war, because in the middle of the war, they actively had support groups. But without the war, it is military operations by a non professional militia against unarmed civilians. and the activity of the war crime of conducting war against civilians puts them in the hyper vulnerable position, which is the reason that they would have needed to be informed about David Boles's insurance structure, which they were supposed to have been informed of, according to the estimates from the military operations, stating that they had already projected the thing and were obligated to have reported it, and had refused to report it lest one of their agendas be undermined by the existence of necessary precautions, and thus the activity of undermining their actions means the concept that they're obligated to report would directly oppose, subvert, and stop the the apprehensible activities conducted, such as giving the black people syphilis and refusing to give them medicine, and whenever they go into the doctor to get medicine, to have the doctors informed and the other support structures in society informed that they have to replace it with a placebo, which then generates the position of a false experiment in order to engage in the abuses for the abuse's sake, or the activity of a satanic ritual, which the thing materially is. These Confederate policies are systemically an enemy combatant to the United States Constitution, which, by definition, those who are the highest threat to it have sworn to not conduct these very violations, and in the breach of their oath of office have disqualified from the office, and as an enemy combatant to the Constitution, have become august at the pretense that they might have to have served it at some point, which then becomes hyper ridiculous to them, and thus engages in the malicious scoffing and progresses to the violent hatred and retaliations by the military operations of their unprofessional militia, which could not sustain themselves, and thus they engage in these magic spells, such as was not limited to the example of not being able to conduct necessary force in order to accomplish their missions, as they specifically undermine it so that they can do the offense that they specifically want to do, and in the activity of conducting the subversion, goes immediately into that action as a defect of their defects. And if it was necessary force in order for their activity, then they would be arresting their own in order to stop the pollution of that activity, hyper accelerating it into the black market's contracted trade for the abuses originally sought under the pretense of the fraudulent racket, which they sold and is a profitable business for its own, similar to the function of how the mafia had operated concerning its criminal abuses, or how the cartels have criminally produced their criminal abuses and sustained themselves off of the existence of those posturing for power under the pretense of their ability to conduct the domination by those activity and abuses, and thus the mechanism of someone having an attractive girlfriend, for example, being able to be abused and have the woman stolen from them and be given to somebody else by the armed robbery, trickery, or other mechanisms, engages in the demonstration of their power and influence by that activity, and thus the rape culture is actively conducted by the arranged marriage and arranged girlfriends mechanism, which is Plato's conspiracy, as the secret conspiracy is the central planning of the social relationships against the American Constitution, which is actively enforced, which they all pretend doesn't exist while they're actively doing it, as the mechanism generates the perpetual resources, and thus the defamation and smear factories engaged in that activity actively promotes those exchanges of resources, which by definition means whenever people agree with the negative reaction obligation according to the spell, then they are paying for the function to happen and hyper amplify the harassment campaigns as it becomes an easier and easier thing to do. The more it happens, the more it happens. And thus, the more you do it, the more it's funded, the more it happens, the more stable the product is, the more it is used as cheese, the more it is used as a gimmick, which is easily used as a crutch, which in the gamer slang can be referred to as spamming. And the use of spamming off of the false accusations generates false convictions, generates the mechanism of lawfare without law or justice, and thus you have the mechanism which hyper amplifies the dangerous mafia technique, which generates more of the harassment, more of the abuse, which degrades the general society in that community, accepting it into the satanic abuse rituals, which hyper accelerates the behavior as a status quo norm under the false convictions generated, which then swings the pendulum back, which then normalizes the abuses directly affiliated with it, which then doesn't have a generic recourse, which is hyper accelerated by the Satanist freaks, which normalize the activity of domestic abuse as a moral good and a social goal. This then is exchanged into the systems specifically designed as freedom fires, which then become terrorists. And if you want to know who the Confederates' enemies are going to be, look at who they're funding right now. And thus, the activity of sacrificing everyone who makes the deal with the devil is a fundamental aspect of having made the contracts with the devils. And thus, to this extent, you actively have sustained the mechanisms of the hate group from those phantom cells, which has hyper accelerated into the criminal to diversifying into the normalized structure, which then collapses into the normal criminal behavior of that activity, such as their hyper amplification of the cartels, which are under the Confederates' control. Um, as the Mexican cartels and others are specifically the servants of the white supremacists conducting those operations, which have made them powerful under the deals with the devils, which has then received the mechanism of the investment of the power of the cartels, which amplifies those druids that control it from the white supremacist wizard KKK contracts, which then engage in the activity of whatever arbitrary mission they want to do while wearing a glove and not getting their hands dirty. And thus, the activity of having hyper amplified it to the position of making the cartels more powerful than the Mexican government expressly explains the mechanism which I have already generically referred to, which has normalized the activity until it becomes the status quo by the pretending of having opposed it, they have created it as above, so below.